Thank you for inviting me. This is a great opportunity, and I've been enjoying it very much to revisit Lawrence, KU. So, in this presentation, my collaborators and I are looking at public opinion in Central Asian states and the attitudes toward major powers, specifically US, China, and Russia. I must say before I begin that my interest, my research interest in Central Asia was spurred also at KU with my co-author Inara Rahmatulaeva and I worked on other topics in regard to Central Asia. So this visit of mine is kind of symbolic in that sense. Previous research has explored desire of major powers to expand their spheres of influence, to annex territories, and do other kind of foreign policy acts quite extensively. However, relatively little attention has been paid to the potential target states. Potential target states which might become the subject of interest of those same major powers. Yeah? And so in this case, we're looking at the public attitudes in Central Asian countries toward China, Russia, and the United States. Now, why is this topic important? As we have learned from the ongoing large-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia, major states pay very significant attention to public attitudes in potential target states. So we know, for example, that the Russian government regarded Ukrainian civilians as friendly to Russia, and therefore the assumption was that as soon as the Russian forces invade, the Ukrainian civilians will meet them and greet them. Yeah, so they will be very friendly toward Russia. So that assumption proved wrong. But the important thing is that governments of these major powers, they pay significant attention to potential repercussions among the populations of the states they target. So at the same time, we know that the Russian officials and pundits, they have expressed their wish to annex Central Asian states as well, on a number of occasions. Of course, depending who you listen to, it could be only northern Kazakhstan, or all of Kazakhstan, or all of Central Asia, but we know that these appetites for expansion have been on now for quite a while. And one of the risk factors appears to be the proliferation of the Russian culture in the target country. Why? Because we know, again, from the Ukrainian example, then not only the Ukrainian example, but the Ukrainian example is, of course, the most recent and most obvious, because then the Russian army can come to rescue the Russian compatriots, Russian language speakers, etc., etc. Right? So these factors appear to be important because Central Asia is kind of in the spotlight as well. Although, of course, nowadays all attention is dedicated to war in Ukraine. Okay, so now why should we care about public opinion? There are different opinions about public opinion. So, for example, there's a popular view that public opinion is shaped by governments. So essentially, public opinion on its own doesn't matter. It is shaped by the elites. Yeah. That's one view. But there is also the opposite view, which says that it's the other way around. The elites actually implement foreign policy based on public opinion. And there's also a third kind of middle ground view, which says that both public and the elites, they influence each other in shaping foreign policy objectives and preferences. Now you might ask, well, okay, that probably is true about democracies, but what about autocracies? Yeah, and Central Asian states are autocratic states. Yeah, to varying degree, of course, but still they are considered to be autocracies. Why does public opinion matter in autocracies? Well, we think that because authoritarian states spend a lot of resources on shaping public opinion, that means they care about that. And therefore, if public opinion didn't matter, authoritarian states would not spend all those resources and wouldn't make all those efforts to shape those opinions. And therefore, we think that public opinion in authoritarian states also does matter, because at least partly it will partly affect what the government policies will be. Now, next we are looking at previous research in this area. Yeah, so previous research has identified cultural and material factors as important factors in determining political behavior. Yeah. So language proficiency is one of the factors that has been extensively studied. So these are the factors that we're considering in our research, as well as exposure to mass media, different types of mass media. Now, Central Asia and Russia. So after the end of the Soviet Union, the Central Asian states started to increase the statuses of their languages, of their vernacular languages. While the Russian language, the status of the Russian language started to decrease. So this is something, the process started soon after 1991, and it has been continuing ever since, but with some fluctuations. There is also variation within Central Asia. In some Central Asian states, Russian language has a relatively high state status. In others, it has a relatively low status. Like, for example, in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, the Russian language has a relatively elevated status, while, for example, in Uzbekistan or Turkmenistan, the status of the Russian language is relatively low. So there's a significant variation there. Also, the other thing is that the Russian language, the influence of the Russian language did not disappear in Russia. It decreased, but it has remained an important factor for a variety of reasons. One is political, one is economic, at least those two. So from a political point of view, the Russian government has always insisted on Central Asian states to give the Russian language special status. Yeah, whenever a Central Asian government does something about the Russian language or their national language, there's always a reaction from Moscow that that is like usually negative. If the vernacular language is elevated, that's always a negative reaction from Moscow. Now. So the other thing is, of course, migration. Russia has received millions of migrants from Central Asia, from all 5 countries. Of course, primarily migrant workers came from Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan. But Kazakhstan and Turkmenistan also had a significant migration toward Russia. So those migration, those economic ties, essentially, they have been also important, and therefore Russian language has remained a significant factor significant social factor in Central Asia. Now, moving on to the next step. Now, normally we associate what's the relationship between nationalism and education? Normally we associate higher levels of education with lower levels of nationalism. So the more educated the person, the less nationalistic he or she is supposed to be. That's the expectation. But there's also significant literature, general literature as well as literature in the former Soviet Union countries, which suggests that that education oftentimes is associated with heightened levels of nationalism. Specifically, there's a fairly old article by now by Alice Giuliano from 2006, I believe, on Tatarstan, which indicates essentially that the early nationalist leaders in Tatarstan in Russia barely spoke Tatar. They were kind of from academia oftentimes. They were educated in Russian. They spoke Russian very well. Russian was their first language, but at the same time they were the nationalist leaders of the various movements in Tatarstan. So in some cases, as well as we have other cases from former Soviet Union countries where we see that former academics, they would become champions of nationalist movements, and we can see that in many situations in the former Soviet Union countries. So in Central Asia, education and the Russian language and nationalism, they have been connected still to this day. Russian language is still the language of more educated class, essentially. Which means, but because there is this connection between education and nationalism, paradoxically, we expect that those Central Asians that are more proficient in the Russian language, at the same time, they will be also more nationalistic and therefore more opposed to Russia overall, on average, of course. Yeah. So that's kind of partly it is due to the Russian current policies and the former policies, right? So Russia, of course, the Russian Empire conquered Central Asia in the 19th century. The conquest was very brutal. Yeah, it involved a lot of killing. When empires expand, they don't expand peacefully, right? Usually it's about killing people, a lot of people, plunder, etc., etc., right? And then the Soviet Union, of course, continued to an extent those policies because, for example, Kazakhstan experienced large-scale famine during the collectivization in the 1930s, whereby I believe 1/5 of the Kazakhs died out in that time. So that's a lot of people, of course, as well as other events. Yeah, and since then, Russia has continued. I mean, of course, Russia has never apologized for any of those. Yeah, and so this kind of attitude, of course, breeds certain type of attitude in response from Central Asians, right? And therefore, if you are an educated Central Asian, you will probably be aware of these events better than the ones that are less educated, and therefore you will be more opposed to Russia. So that's kind of the logic. And therefore, we have a couple of expectations, a couple of hypotheses in regard to these attitudes. So essentially, more educated individuals in Central Asia will be more aware of the truly pernicious policies present of Russia in the region, and therefore more critical of Russia. But at the same time, ironically, those more educated individuals will be very well versed in the Russian language. So, and therefore this paradox that if, so the expectation is that if a person belongs to the titular group in Central Asia, so by titular we mean Kazakhs in Kazakhstan, Uzbeks in Uzbekistan, etc., and at the same time the primary language at home is Russian, those individuals will view Russia and China less positively than other groups, and the US more positively than other groups. That's kind of the expectation, and the other way around. Those individuals, those members of the titular ethnic groups that use primarily the titular language will view Russia and China more positively, and the United States less positively than other groups. Why we combine Russia and China together? Because over the past years, the two countries have become increasingly more allied, and therefore, in popular imagination, they are seen as something that, you know, two entities that are relatively close to each other. But also, I mean, there's more to that, of course, because obviously the other obvious distinction between China, Russia, and the US is that China and Russia are neighboring states. The US is far away. So they have, Central Asians have experienced various kind of events related to Russia and China because they are in the neighborhood, right? But the US is a faraway power, so they have not experienced the US directly. Yeah, like, for example, Latin Americans have experienced the United States, right? That would be a different story. So, so that's kind of a part of the story. Now, the data we use comes from Central Asian Survey. Yeah. We use all publicly available waves, 11 waves for the 2017 to 2022. They are held twice a year, so therefore they're relatively few years, but many waves for that period. So we include only 4 Central Asian countries because Tajikistan is included because they don't have, in the Tajik survey, they don't have the question that we use to construct our dependent variable. So it's not in our sample. So this is our dependent variable. This is how we construct it essentially. So it's a 4-level ordinal scale of favorability of China, Russia, and the US. So from 1 to 4. So 1 is the less favorable view, and 4 is, 1 is the least favorable view, and 4 is the most favorable view of the country. Okay. So this is a summary statistics graph, which indicates a few interesting things. So, for example, you notice that most respondents have positive view toward all 3 major powers. That means more than 50% in each country has a positive view of the country in question, whether it is the US, China, or Russia. The other thing is that Russia enjoys most positive views, most positive attitudes in the region compared to the US and China, which is probably not very surprising given the fact that Central Asians on average perhaps know Russia better than China and the US. The other interesting thing is that that in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, China and the US are seen at about the same level of positive, negative view, while in Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan, they view China on average more positively than the US. And the least positive view of Russia in this sample is observed in Kazakhstan. Okay. We have also some time series, how these attitudes have changed over time. And you can see, so China, their divergent views, divergent views of the respondents. Yeah. So in some countries there has been an uptick in positive view of China. In others there was a downward trajectory. So the data for Turkmenistan is sporadic. There is a big gap when the surveys were not conducted in Turkmenistan. Therefore, there is this gap. Now, Russia, we see that overall declining trend. And so remember, the data here ends in 2022. It is probably not a big stretch of imagination if we say that likely this decline has continued to this day, given the war in Ukraine. And the average attitudes toward the US have also been divergent. In some countries, they have been going up slightly, in others, staying mostly flat, and in Uzbekistan, going downward. Okay, so that's our dependent variable. Now, what do we use for our independent variables? Ethnic identity. Yeah. So essentially, we code a titular group. So Kazakhs in Kazakhstan will be coded as 1. Yeah, everybody else will be coded as 0. Right. Kazakhs in, say, in Uzbekistan will be coded as 0. right? Because they are not considered to be a titular group in Uzbekistan. So that's kind of how we coded the ethnicity. And then the prevalent language at home, also in the same way, it's a dichotomous variable. So if it is a titular language, then it is coded for titular 1, for everybody else 0. If it is, we also are interested in the Russian language, so if the person predominantly speaks home Russian, then they're coded as 1, and if not, then 0. Yeah. So also we have some control variables as well as others that we can discuss later, but let's concentrate on ethnic identity and language at home with those two for now. So these are the results of 3 regressions with a dependent variable each representing favorability of China, favorability of China, Russia, and the US. Yeah. So note the colors, red, green, and blue. Now, we can see this, we're interested specifically in this interaction term, titular ethnicity times titular language. And we see that the relationship between this interaction and favorability of China and Russia is positive, while with the US it's negative. So essentially, when a person of titular ethnicity speaks a titular language, they are more they have more favorable view of China and Russia than other groups, and less favorable view of the US than other groups. So that's the interpretation. How we know it, when these dots with whiskers, they are to the right of this vertical 0 line, that means they have a positive relationship with the dependent variable. If they are to the left, then the relationship is negative. And if the whiskers, as long as the whiskers, these small whiskers, they don't cross this vertical line. Yeah. That signifies statistical significance of 95% in this case. Okay, so now next next the Russian one, the interaction of titular ethnicity and the Russian language. So we see that if a person of titular ethnicity speaks primarily Russian language, then they tend to indicate the US than other groups, and less favorable view of China, red, and Russia, green. So that's briefly our findings. We have also marginal effects, but yeah, these are kind of, they will take a lot of time, I think, to go through, so I'll just skip them for now. But we could come back to them because what we find also, because we can look at the country level, right? And we see that those relationships, they do not hold across all countries in the same way. Yeah. So, but we can look at them later. Now, so in conclusion, surprise, surprise, proficiency in the language of a major power does not necessarily increase the affinity with that power. Yeah. Who would have thought? So the other thing is that Russia and China are seen similarly in Central Asia. Although there are some important differences as well, but we can come back to that if you want. But they are to an extent they are seen as similar in the sense that the same people who view Russia, it's the same types of individuals that see Russia positively, they also regard China positively. It is important to note that these effects are relational. So when we say that ethnically titular group who speaks Russian is more on average more supportive of the US, that's compared to other groups, not in absolute terms. And finally, how things will change over time. These relationships will not hold forever. Likely, for example, so one of the big assumptions that we make is that on average, more educated people in Central Asia tend to know the Russian language more. So that's a crux of this relationship, right? But imagine a situation where vernacular languages or national languages of the Central Asian states become more and more important. Yeah, so more and more educated people are more well versed in their national languages and less well versed in the Russian language, and then these relationships will not hold anymore, of course, right? But 30 years, more than 30 years after the end of the Soviet Union, you can tell that the Russian language still plays a really important role in the region, and it has some meaningful implications for political behavior of individuals in question, in Central Asia. And we don't know how this will change and when it will change. Maybe it will take another 30 years to change this situation. Much will depend on how the war in Ukraine will end, of course, right? So that's a fairly obvious thing to say. But also, it is the other thing is the irony of this situation is that the Russian government has spent significant resources on increasing the status of the Russian language in Central Asia as well as in other former Soviet Union countries and beyond, by the way. And ironically, we see that the expectation the Russian government probably had is that the more people know the Russian language, the more the Russian Federation will spread its kind of soft power influence, etc., etc. But in Central Asian example, we see that these relationships might not necessarily be as straightforward as assumed, right? So more Russian speaker native people in the Central Asian states, titular ethnic groups, they tend to be more critical actually of Russia than individuals who don't speak Russian or don't know the Russian language very well, because the Russian language remains a really important factor in the education in Central Asia. I think I will conclude with that, and thank you. And if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Or just try.
Any questions for Professor Dzutsati?
No, you go first. I have a very general question. But is there any reason that you did not include Kazakhstan, or was it not part of the data that you derived from?
Yeah, they didn't have. Yeah, that's a good question. Unfortunately, there was no question on attitudes toward these three major powers, and therefore we could not include it. Yeah, that's the only reason. Yeah.
Is there a reason that Russia would want to take over any of these states again?
Well, we don't know. Of course, we can also we can only judge the Russian intentions by what we can observe, and what we can observe are statements by the Russian politicians as well as pundits that express this wish. Maybe it's a joke, maybe it's just a political tool, right? But if you are a responsible actor in Central Asia, right, you can't just expect, especially after what happened in Ukraine, that these are jokes, right? You can't just, you can't just dismiss them as kind of unimportant, notes. So, so we don't know. But I mean, there are some historians definitely in the room. So, I mean, I can't think of many examples when a major power stopped its territorial expansion on its own, of its own goodwill, without being stopped in the past 200 years, except for Bismarck's Germany after the unification of Germany, maybe the US, and that's probably it. So, in other words, if Russia does capture even part of Ukrainian territory, why stop? Why? If you cannot expand further, then what's the reason for stopping? Yeah. So we also know, for example, again, historian Kotkin's book on Stalin. Very interesting. After the 1917 revolution, Stalin consulted with Shapashnikov, who was the former Tsarist era general or officer, and they were discussing plans how to recapture lands that the Russian Empire lost after the 1917 revolution. So this kind of path dependency is a really important factor in history, because leaders are thinking, once we had Poland, once we had Finland, once we had that land, and this land, why shouldn't we, have it now? Especially as, we have captured already, for example, Ukraine or part of Ukraine, of course, through sacrifice, through this and that, but, what next, essentially? If it is on the political agenda, they will try. Especially as Central Asian states, of course, are very, very, prone to break down, right? They have relatively weak governments, and depends, of course, which Central Asian country we look at. They have very large. Kazakhstan has a huge land border with Russia, which is essentially undefended, right? There isn't a lot of resources put to protect Kazakhstan, and so they are, only if China supports them, right? Essentially, then things will probably be different. Other than that, the US will not intervene. We can be pretty much sure about that.